in here today. It's hot in here today, hotter than it normally, or it feels like it to me.
Next week's not gonna be though. Look at the weather.
Oh yeah, I know. It usually starts at like on Halloween. It's like that's the day when it starts getting cold.
Well, no, Monday.
Really?
Monday, it's supposed to be, if I remember right from looking this morning, it said 46 for the high and a 50% chance of rain.
Oh yay!
Yay.
I love this.
I don't. I'm a summer baby. I actually am a winter baby, but I'm a summer baby at heart.
I'm a summer baby, but I love the cold. So.
No, I live for those 110 days.
Oh no! I hate it.
Okay, so I'm hoping we can get through Jackson in a couple of days. If not, we won't. But when we finish Jackson, we'll take the test over the nationalism and sectionalism and this section together. So the last section we did in this section. I will come up front and say Jackson is not one of my favorite presidents, but you know, everybody has their personalities, and he had a huge one. We ended with Jackson being elected. We didn't go into his election all that deep, but it was very dirty. There weren't a lot of issues discussed. There was a lot of mudslinging. It was brought up that he and his wife had lived in adultery. She thought she was divorced, and she wasn't. When they actually found out, they, you know, got the divorce, got remarried, but you know, it was still mudslung. But Jackson was our first president not to come from a prominent colonial family. He was really a self-made man. And we're going to be getting into that era of the American myth of the self-made man. We're not quite there yet. You know, we're not quite to the rags to riches stories, but this is where we start to see the roots of that getting laid. Jackson was a self-made soldier. He was a politician. He was a slave-owning land speculator from the backcountry. He was, in a lot of people's mind, the common man. He was the commoner who came to the White House. He was proud, he was gritty, he was short-tempered. He didn't have an issue with that. He was happily short-tempered and angry. His father had died before he was born. His mother died of cholera when he was 15. She was a housekeeper who barely kept the household together. He had two brothers that were killed by redcoats in front of him, and he was left scarred, probably emotionally, definitely physically, by the incident because the British officer slashed him across the face with a sword. He came to believe to be a man, you had to be vicious, you had to be tough. He often behaved as a tyrant when he was a military officer. It wasn't just Indians and British agents he had executed. He had a teenager shot for disobeying orders. He didn't like to be disobeyed. After the army, he became an attorney. He bought him a plantation, became a planter. He served in the Tennessee legislature. He was a U.S. Senator from Tennessee. And he was one of the most popular politicians since Washington. He captured the imagination of everyone. He is a war hero. He defended New Orleans. He took Florida. Even though we gave it back, he still took it. He was a hero. And that's a lot of what propelled him into office. Now, as Jackson came into office, the United States has been changing. This is not the United States that Washington and Jefferson ruled over. There are 24 states, 13 million people. The newest group of immigrants are Irish and Germans. So it's getting a little more mixed. And we're talking about a lot of Irish and a lot of Germans. The national population is still doubling every 23 years, which is fairly rapid. In the wake of the industrialization after the War of 1812, foreign demand for American goods was high. English investments, as they have recovered from the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic War, now the English are starting to invest in American businesses. That's fueling an economic and transportation boom. Cities are starting to grow even more. We talked about how after the War of 1812, they were starting to have undue influence beyond their size. That is really snowballing now. Cities were now dynamic centers of commerce, industry, finance, politics. They're growing at twice the rate of the rural population. So people are leaving the country, leaving the rural areas, and going to the cities. And within the cities, you're seeing a class stratification. You're starting to see some clear lines of the haves and have-nots. Because a lot of these people who are moving to the city are moving there to be wage laborers. So you have kind of a new group of people in the country. We're losing that self-sufficient farm idea of, you live on the farm, you grow what you need, you sell the surplus, and life is great. People are now becoming wage laborers, which means they rely on someone else for their basic needs. They rely on somebody else for a paycheck, which buys their basic needs, but it's still there. There's also this new market economy that is growing. And as it grows, it's going to push infrastructure with new roads and canals. And most of these roads and canals are going to go east-west, not north-south. And they're going to tie the west to the east. And you're also seeing more of a stratification between regions as regions start to specialize. The South is still agricultural. That manufacturing boom that Calhoun was hoping for doesn't happen. And we'll talk about that more in detail, but the short version is you make more money raising cotton. It doesn't diversify, but it makes a lot of money. Cotton was very, very lucrative. So why diversify? The North is becoming more and more industrialized. And the West is just, I want to say it's just sort of out there, but it's not. It's agricultural. It's some business, but it's a force that is going to have to be reckoned with. And it's a force that the North and the South need to align with, because when you have 3 people in a group, you don't want to be the odd man out. And the North and the South are not going to pair up necessarily over a lot of issues. And up until we get to the Civil War, there is a lot of sectional headbutting. Okay, so lost track of where I wasn't looking at my notes, lost where I went. All right, so this new era, this new transformation doesn't come easily, and it's unsettling to a lot of people, including Jackson. In his heart is a Jeffersonian. He believes in he wants that Jeffersonian idea of a small government of agrarian farmers. But that boat has sailed. We're not going back to that era. And that boat sailing has left a lot of people kind of at odds. And I will say, Jefferson did not approve of Jackson being a Jeffersonian. He thought Jackson was dangerous and didn't need to be president. But people were no longer self-sufficient entirely. We have a lot of people who are wage laborers. Farms are becoming more commercialized, which means, yes, you can go back to self-sufficiency if you have the land and you have the farm, but if you're relying on a crop to make you money, you're now relying on outside forces that are beyond your control. And it calls into question this traditional assumption that a republic relies on people being independent and self-reliant property owners. It goes back to that idea of virtue. You want a group of people who are neither too rich to lord over someone else or too poor to become independent, to become dependent. That was the idea, the ideal. No one in the late 18th, early 19th century thought a republic could survive without a virtuous constituency. And the best way to do that was to have everybody kind of on the same page. But as this market economy grows, you're starting to see class stratification, and people are getting on different pages. Now, Jackson did seek to expand, and not just Jackson. We always blame the president, but the president never acts alone. The president is not responsible for everything that goes on in his administration. You got to get laws passed by legislatures, so you have to have them acting with you. So basically, it's the Republicans. Jackson's party sought to expand economic opportunity and political participation. But when it comes down to it, most common folk remain common folk. As Jackson said, distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talent or education or wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. So he's saying that government cannot create equality, but what government can do, if you go on, is create everybody, to give everybody an equal chance to be what they can be. You know, Lucia might have great artistic skills, but she might be a horrible economist. She can't handle money. How Carlin, on the other hand, might handle money really well, but can't draw a stick figure. They have different talents. The government isn't going to change their talents, but the government can create a basis where she can find a market for her art and she can run a bank. Except in the 1830s, you're both women and neither one of you would have that option. So you also got to remember, keep this in the back of your mind. This is for white men. All of this is for white men. And all the rest of us are out. But giving an equal chance does not mean equal results. And as one Republican commented, true republicanism requires that every man shall have an equal chance to be free to become as unequal as he can. But they do expand the options. And because Jackson is seen as a commoner coming to the White House, that in itself encouraged more people to get involved. Because if he can do it as the orphan son of a housekeeper, why can't I? So Jackson is president. Jackson was determined to change the structure and tone of the US government. He, like I said, was very Jeffersonian in his ideas. He wanted to eliminate what he viewed as elitism. He wanted to lower taxes, reduce spending, shrink bureaucracy, pay off the debt. He absolutely hates the National Bank, even though Jefferson finally came around to the idea, Madison and Monroe came around to the idea. Jackson doesn't come around to other people's ideas. If it's not Jackson's idea, then it ain't gonna fly. So Jackson hates the National Bank, and that is one of his things. He also seriously dislikes the Indians and wants to remove them. Although, if you remember back, he had no problem fighting with the Indians. He had Indians on his side when he fought in Florida. He had Indians and pirates on his side when he had like the most multicultural army in the world at the Battle of New Orleans. About the only group he didn't have represented in the Battle of New Orleans were women, and you can almost claim he did because the nuns were praying for him. There's actually a church in New Orleans that the head mother prayed and said that if Jackson was successful, they would hold a feast of Thanksgiving, and they've held one there every year since the Battle of New Orleans. But he didn't want him in his country. And yes, this was his country. He believed that no man should stay in political service for long. You should serve one term of whatever it is that you are serving, either as a senator, as a representative, or as president, and then return to private life. This was what he says, not going to be what he does. And he actually did not remove a lot of people from office. He only removes 9% and replaces them with other officials, 20% during his entire term. From the beginning, his administration is divided between the followers of Secretary of State Martin Van Buren and those of Vice President John Calhoun. So Calhoun is Jefferson's vice president. Martin Van Buren is the Secretary of State. Van Buren obviously is in the cabinet, so is Calhoun. They both have very distinctive ideas, and they're both fighting to get Jackson's ear. Van Buren has the advantage. One, he is a born politician. They called him the little magician, which always reminds me of the governor in Best Little Whorehouse from Texas, or Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, but that's a side note. Calhoun didn't have quite the same touch. Calhoun was an extremely intelligent man, a very foreboding man. He was very intimidating, but he is very centered on his Southern interests. And at this point, he is kind of between, he starts out as a war hawk nationalist, and he's still in that phase, but he's switching to the sectionalist idea. And early on, Calhoun doesn't actually do it, but there's an opportunity for Van Buren to get ahead. And I bring this up because you got to realize people are people. And personalities play a huge role in politics. I mean, you obviously see that in politics today, that, you know, the people in office, their personalities play a role. Well, they did back then too. The Secretary of War under Jackson was a man named John Eaton. John Eaton, who was a personal friend of Jackson's, hence he is the appointment, marries a lady named Margaret O'Neill. Called her Peggy. Never quite understood how Peggy becomes a shortcut, a nickname for Margaret, but it does. Peggy does not have the high-bred background of most of the cabinet wives. She had been a tavern owner. Her husband had committed suicide, supposedly upon finding out that she was having an affair with John Eaton. But he was dead before they married. Whether or not the suicide was, no one's really proved whether there was an affair or not. But the other ladies, led by Floride Calhoun, John Calhoun's wife, snubbed her. Now, this should not play a role in our national politics, but it most certainly did. Jackson took great offense to this. He was very sympathetic, made public statements of what a wonderful woman Miss O'Neill was. Well, I guess now she's Mrs. Eaton. And generally defended her. And a lot of this can probably go back to the mudslinging and the name calling when, it came out that his wife had not been divorced before they got married. Van Buren names this Eaton malaria and pushes the blame fully on Calhoun. Further making that divide between him and between Van Buren and Calhoun, and putting a little more thought in Jackson's head that Calhoun is not to be trusted. And like I said, this is a very personal thing, really has nothing to do with government, but it does affect how they all operate. Van Buren also used financing for transportation against Calhoun. Calhoun, as a nationalist, had long promoted internal improvements, mostly with the idea that if you can tie the West and the South together, they will, become dependent on each other. And Jackson wasn't necessarily against roads or against internal improvements, but he had a lot of the same constitutional scruples that Monroe and Madison and Jefferson had. There's really nothing in the Constitution that says the government can do internal improvements. So the first bill that comes up is the Maysville Road Bill in 1830. This would be a road between Maysville, Kentucky to Lexington, Kentucky. Now, it is part of a larger plan to tie into the national road, the one that goes, the Cumberland Road that we talked about. And it was supposed to tie in through Cincinnati, which would have been Ohio. But the bill is actually just to finance this section of the road that is in Kentucky. And Jackson vetoes it. He sees this as a chance to get a dig in at Calhoun and at Clay, who he doesn't like. Because Clay's from Kentucky, Calhoun wants these internal improvements. But his argument is it's not interstate travel. It is within one state, and that state should be responsible for the road. He did support interstate projects. And this idea is going to, and we're going to talk about, in the next section, we're going to talk about the road building and canal building and railroad building, because all of that is all going on at the same time, but we're going to get through the political part of this stuff first. This is going to be the basis for why most of that is built with state and private funds. Because unless you could stretch it over several states, the feds were not going to get involved, at least not under Jackson. Disappointed, but not entirely working off the Maysville issue. The issue of nullification comes back up. Now, I mentioned Calhoun is changing from this war hawk nationalist to a states' rights sectionalist. South Carolina, which is where he is from, is suffering from prolonged agricultural depression. There are a lot of factors in this. A lot of people have immigrated west. They lost about 70,000 residents in the 20s. They're going to lose more in the 30s. Cotton prices are not great, but not bad. But cotton is getting harder to grow. In South Carolina, the yield is less because cotton is very hard on the soil. You can't keep planting cotton year after year in the same field and get the same results. Cotton strips the soil of nitrogen, and if you don't rotate your crops, your yield just becomes less and less every year until it finally won't produce anything. And it's not that they don't know this. They just don't practice it. Farmers apparently don't change very rapidly. And you could plant things in between that would, like alfalfa puts nitrogen back in the soil. Peanuts, they will find later, will put nitrogen back in the soil. But this perennial planting is part of the depression. They're very defensive of slavery, which is kind of a side note, but part of this. And Calhoun blames the protective tariff. Now, they have passed or they pass in 1828 a very high tariff. Opponents call it the tariff of abomination. I love their names. They had such a great grasp of words. It's the tariff of abomination. And it forces Calhoun to pick sides. His political hold in South Carolina depends on him supporting the planters. If he doesn't, he's going to be out, and out is not where Calhoun wants to be. So he writes anonymously a document called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest that explains, again, the idea of nullification and interposition. Now, it's a little less severe than the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, even though it draws on those and references those. It goes into a long technical debate of how a federal law could be nullified, but bottom line, it states that a state can nullify a federal law. And if a state nullifies the federal law, then the feds have a choice of either throwing out the law or changing it. It comes like a hair short of saying secession. And he also references the Hartford Convention, where the New Englanders wanted to do the same thing. On the heels of this, because now the South Carolina has thrown this out there, you have a debate in Congress. The actual issue of the debate is the sale of public lands, which has become kind of stale. They're not selling real quickly. They're going to, but they're not at this particular moment. And there is an issue, I'm not sure I had that right, actually, hang on. There is this issue that, hang on, let me check something because I may have just told you something wrong. Okay, they are selling okay, but there are immense tracts in the West. And in Congress, it has come up that they needed to be discussed. What are we going to do with these immense tracts of land besides just keep selling, the way they have been? The underlying issue of all of this is still this tariff. And the Webster-Hayne debate is in 1830. So Samuel Foote of Connecticut puts forth the Foote Resolution, which would restrict the sales of land in the West. Thomas Benton of Missouri, in the West, accuses the North, Samuel Foote's from Connecticut, of trying to slow the settlement of the West in order to maintain cheap labor and political leverage. This isn't a new accusation. They've been accused of this before. And to a point, it's true. Robert Hayne from South Carolina takes Benton's side. In part because he wants to kind of tie this north-south or west, not north-south, west-south together. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts defends the East, and he does it. He's a very good debater. Now, Daniel Webster is the cousin or brother to the Webster who did the dictionary. He is a lawyer. He is probably the foremost lawyer in the United States at this time, and he is a heck of a debater, and he's a heck of an orator. We don't go watch people talk. I mean, other than like a comedy show. But in the 1800s, orators were a type of entertainment. You would go and listen to somebody tell a story, make a speech, and the people who could talk really, really well did very well. It was an art form, and Webster had mastered it. And he tricks Hayne into dropping the idea of the West-South unification into talking about states' rights and nullification. Which totally blows the whole issue out of the water and brings slavery back to the forefront. And this idea of states' rights is growing. Webster ends his speech with the line, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." He wins the debate. It actually comes to nothing because the Foot Resolution just kind of fades off into the sunset. But it puts on the table this idea of states' rights. And how are we going to deal with this idea of states' rights? And it's going to further the rift between Jackson and Calhoun. Because Jackson, as up to this point, has not spoken out on states' rights. And as a Jeffersonian and as a Southerner, there is some thought that he would come down on the side of states' rights. And at this point, we're not talking about a specific states' right. It's underlying that it's slavery, but it's not actually been thrown out there yet. At this point, it could be any states' right. Like I said, the Hartford Convention, the North tries the same thing. But Calhoun, but they don't have to wait long for Jackson to speak out and say where he stood. There was a dinner party in honor of Jefferson's birthday. And everybody is making speeches. Van Buren and Jackson had plotted ahead of time that Jackson should present a toast proclaiming his opposition to nullification. So when it was Jackson's turn, after 24 other toasts, he raised his glass, glared at Calhoun, and announced, "Our Union, it must be preserved," which is a pretty strong statement against nullification and against state rights. Calhoun, who followed Jackson, tries to strike back and says, "The Union, next to our liberty most dear, may we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and the burden of the Union." But it was not to happen. And then on top of that, Jackson finds evidence that Calhoun was prepared to censor him for his actions in Florida back in 1818. He finds some of the documentation, or the documentation was found and left where he could see it. They have an exchange of letters which ends with Jackson saying, "Understanding you now, no further communication with you on this subject is necessary." At that point, he removes all Calhoun partisans from his cabinet and completely cuts his vice president out of any decision-making he can. And we're getting close to another election. Calhoun's not going to be his vice presidential candidate. I'll give you a heads up. The election of 32 is notable, not just because of all the infighting that we're going to see, but because there's a third party. The anti-Masonic party springs up, and it has its basis in this fear, distrust of the Masonic order. Masons have been around for a very, very long time. It is a secret society, but right before this time, there had been a man that was killed in New York, and the accusations were that he was killed because he had divulged the secrets of the order and that they had him killed. Whether that is true or not is irrelevant. It's sort of a weak basis to form a national political party on, but okay, they did. What is important about them, however, is that they have a national convention. They're the first political party to have a national convention. We still have national conventions. They're also the first party to declare a platform. I don't know what their platform said, kind of irrelevant, but they had a platform. They had a statement of, this is why we think we should be elected. This is what we stand for. No one else had done this before. You had individual political leaders saying what they stood for, but you didn't actually have a party platform. And they will run William Wirt of Maryland as their candidate. I think he wins Virginia. No, Vermont. He gets Vermont, but that's it. But the other two parties will follow suit. The National Republicans will have their convention in Baltimore. They will name Henry Clay as their candidate. The Democratic Party, which they were Democratic Republicans, now they're just Democrats, will also have their party, theirs in Baltimore, and they will declare Jackson and Martin Van Buren as their two candidates. I don't know who ran with Henry Clay. Jackson, if you remember, had said that a person should serve their term and then go back to being a civilian. Well, he was asked not to do that. His supporters were afraid that if he did not run, Calhoun might have enough strength to become president. And that was enough to convince Jackson. I don't think it took a whole lot to convince him, but that was enough to convince him that maybe he should run again. Because, you know, after all, part of a nomination should not be sought, but it shouldn't be turned down either. That was his excuse the first time he was elected. Calhoun does a little bit of maneuvering, which ends up biting him. Van Buren had resigned as Secretary of State to go serve in London as a minister. Calhoun blocked his appointment in the Senate. Well, that made Van Buren available to run as vice president. Calhoun blocked his appointment just out of pure meanness. You know, it'll kill him if he doesn't get to go to England. And Thomas Benton, one of the senators, said, "You may have killed a minister, but you just elected a vice president." So Calhoun is out. Van Buren is going to become vice president. And now Calhoun is free to completely openly oppose Jefferson. And we have another nullification issue. Where are we at? South Carolina will pass another ordinance. You're going to see a tendency for South Carolina to be on the leading edge of Southern disagreement. We'll go with that word. Slavery is starting to be thrown, and anti-slavery is starting to be thrown around more and more. And there is a fear in South Carolina that the federal authority to impose tariffs might be used to end slavery. I've not quite figured out their logic on this, but this is why they passed this ordinance. And so the South Carolina ordinance forbids federal agents in Charleston to collect tariffs after 1833. And this is passed because Jackson becomes president again. And they fear he's going to pass more tariffs. That's where the timing of this comes in. Jackson responds. He views nullification as treason. And he vows to enforce the tariff. He declares nullification, that should be impractical absurdity, not practical, impractical. He says nullification is an impractical absurdity, and we're not putting up with it. Jackson rallies the troops. He sends soldiers to South Carolina to enforce the tariff. South Carolina reacts by bringing out their militia. So we're on the verge of having a military standoff in South Carolina over taxes. In 1833, Jackson requests a force bill which would authorize him the use of the army, which he doesn't need. He already has that ability, but this would strengthen his hand. And now it's time for Clay to swoop in. You know, Clay is the great compromiser. He gets one more compromise in. Clay arranges a bill in Congress that will reduce the tariff in steps, with the final reduction being in 1842. It's not quite what South Carolina wants, but they also don't want to go to war. They didn't think it would get this far, and both sides right now need to be able to save face. On March 1st, Congress passes the compromise tariff and the force bill. Jackson signs them both. South Carolina rescinds the nullification of the tariff bill, but then they nullify the force bill to save face, but it doesn't matter because the force bill wasn't needed anyway. And the status quo is maintained. But for a while there, you have a very tense moment as this whole states' rights nullification slavery issue is starting to get overheated. We will stop there. And that was probably a high point for Jackson. I mean, he did avoid, splitting the country. When we come back, we'll talk about he didn't see it as a low point, but what most historians see as a low point in Jackson's administration. We'll talk about the Indian removal when we come back. All right. Thank y'all for being here. I know 8 o'clock in the morning is kind of rough, but I appreciate it because you guys are my regular ones.